Of course, Donald Trump's takeover of Washington, D.C. Has been in the news lately, but he faced some tough questioning about this at a recent press conference. Here's Benny Johnson posing with Press Secretary Carolyn Leavitt. I swear we didn't plan on matching today. Ha 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 ha. How funny. How funny is that? Well, he got the first question of the day from the alt media wing now. So, they did this thing where they were inviting podcasters into the White House press conference. Notice we did not get our invitation. The
got lost in the mail.
Yeah, they mean Tim Pool, Benny Johnson, right? Paid influencers is who they mean. So they're going to go first to the paid influencer section of the room for the first question of the day about Donald Trump's D.C. takeover.
We'll start with our new media seat, who is our podcast host today, Benny Johnson. Benny, why don't you kick us off, and thanks for being here.
Thank you, Caroline. As a D.C. resident of 15 years, I lived on Capitol Hill. I witnessed so many muggings and so much theft. I lost track. I was carjacked. I have murders on my Ring camera and mass shootings. I witnessed a woman on my block get held up at gunpoint for $20. And my house was set ablaze in an arson with my infant child inside. And so to any reporter that says and lies that D.C. is a safe place to live and work, let me just say this. Thank you.
I was arrested outside of Glory Hole, even though I explained I was just doing research.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Yeah.
Thank you for making the city safe, because no parent should have to go through what my family went through, having the fire department rip open their door to save their infant child.
Wow, what a hard-hitting journalist this guy is. Thank you for keeping the city safe.
Thank you for your work on securing this city. My question to you is this. Nancy Pelosi has attacked the president for deploying the National Guard to the city, saying that it is to cover for his incompetence. Hillary Clinton has also attacked the president for securing the city of Washington, D.C. I'd like to get your response to Nancy Pelosi and Hillary Clinton.
Sure.
So my question is Nancy Pelosi a gin-sodden whore who should shut her bitch mouth?
Yeah, that was quite a hard-hitting question. I don't know how she's going to handle that one.
Quite a question, yeah.
Well, first of all,
is there a reason she's dressing as Wednesday Addams? Is it because the second season dropped?
That's right. She hasn't been wearing her cross lately.
That's what they say. That's what they say. Ever since she had to start lying about the Epstein files, I guess she's afraid smoke will start coming off her chest.
Yeah, exactly.
For securing the city of Washington, D.C., I'd like to get your response to Nancy Pelosi and Hillary.
Sure. Well, first of all, Benny, I'm so sorry that happened to you and your family. There have been, unfortunately, far too many victims of crime in this city, and I know the majority of residents in the District of Columbia agree with you. In fact, a new poll from the Washington Post I was reading this morning, this was released in May of 2024, so it's quite funny how many of you in the media agreed with what the president was saying yesterday, but now once the president says it, many of you are disagreeing with him. But this poll released by the Washington Post found that 65% of district residents think crime is an extremely serious or a very serious problem. And this was up from 56% last year. So
Okay. Well, notice she did not cite any crime statistics. She cited people's feelings about crime.
Yeah.
Now, we said in our last segment, I don't mean to dismiss people's feelings about crime. I think you should take people's feelings about crime very seriously. As we know, based on our last segment, crime is actually at a 30-year low in D.C., significantly down from the post-pandemic years, 2022 and 2023. One possible explanation for why people might be more concerned with crime now than they were a few years ago. I mean, how do you know? You're talking about measuring people's attitudes year to year, a 10% increase. What you can see is that the numbers are in fact trending down. And notice she had no actual stats to back her up. And there's a lot you could do to stop crime. There's a lot you could do about crime short of commandeering the police department by sending National Guard troops in to do traffic stops and patrolling streets in places like Georgetown, which we'll see a little bit later. But Benny Johnson did tweet out a couple days before this some security camera footage from outside his house. So he says, my security camera will show you what life was like for a family living in D.C. Here's a mass shooting and murder in my front lawn. Now, it's not really clear what we're looking at on the video. It does seem to be a gunshot. We can't show that on YouTube, obviously. And then there is a fire at his house, smoke coming out of one of the windows. You can see that in the screenshot there. So here's a mass shooting and murder in my front lawn, followed by my house being set on fire with my wife and infant child inside. These are regular occurrences for D.C. residents. I live just a few blocks from the U.S. Capitol. There were open drug deals and arms deals constantly outside my house. My family was threatened on a near daily basis. Racist epithets were hurled at my wife and infant children. Rocks were thrown at us, and we walked down the street. We were constantly targeted for being white in a black neighborhood. No one gave a shit. Judges and cops saw us as the problem. When D.C. defunded their police, the city turned into a deadly war zone. Every resident was terrorized. D.C. is a failed state. D.C. home rule is a mistake. So that was the Home Rule Act of 1973, right, coming out of the civil rights protests and the MLK riots, meaning the riots in response to the assassination of Martin Luther King. The worst, most entitled racists living off your tax dollars and desecrating our nation's capital, turning the seat of Western civilization into a deadly welfare narco state. Entire neighborhoods need to be cleared out and bulldozed. This can't happen soon enough. Every American must support Trump federalizing the city and martial law as a point of American pride. Restore the seat of Western civilization. And here he is doubling down on that claim with commentary by friend of the show, Max Blumenthal. I like this. Submental Conservatism Inc. propagandist Benny Johnson says Trump's occupation of D.C. should be an Israeli-style ethnic cleansing operation. I believe entire neighborhoods need to be emptied, need to be bulldozed. So we'll watch this. This is a few minutes.
Trump is doing God's work by refederalizing D.C. By the way, D.C. was set up as a federal city. It's in the Constitution. It's how our founding fathers intended it. These laws are still fully enforceable. They've never been rescinded or amended. President Trump and the executive, through the House of Representatives, controls Washington, D.C. President Trump controls budgets. House of Representatives and the Speaker of the House is technically and historically the mayor, the lead of D.C. That still remains on the books. What happened to D.C., especially during the civil rights period, was that protesters that were bussed up here stayed here. The city was burned to the ground. This happened during massive riots throughout the 60s and 70s. Mass swaths of the city were torched and were never really rebuilt.
Okay, it's hard to tell exactly what he's referring to there. Obviously, you had the civil rights protests like the Martin Luther King-led March on Washington during the civil rights era. But then you also had, the most notorious riots in D.C. in terms of this time period that he's talking about was in response to the assassination of Martin Luther King. Now, he doesn't get that specific. He just kind of lumps that in. Oh, yeah, a bunch of black people came up protesting for their rights and burned the city down. No, there were riots in response to the killing of Martin Luther King. Like I said, I'm not sure what he's referring to when he says that. He is, I believe, deliberately sort of vague and open-ended about that, but he goes on.
And so what President Trump is doing is reasserting control of not only our nation's capital, but truly the seat of Western civilization. There's one final little note here that kind of blends outside of the personal, which is that Washington, D.C. is a representation of the work of your forefathers and mine. It is, by every measure, a very beautiful city architecturally. It is a sacred city. It is a sovereign place with the monuments to great men and women who've sacrificed far more than you or I could ever dream for this country. It must be preserved because the peoples of Earth come here by the millions per year in order to witness the success or failures of our systems. And if you are a proud patriot and you love this country and you wish for it to be reflected honorably to the peoples of Earth, then Washington, D.C. must be swept clean. I believe entire neighborhoods probably need to be emptied, need to be bulldozed. I believe that there are places that are so crime-ridden and so infested that you just need to, you're just going to have to crack down. You're going to have to do the job, and you're going to have to get the crime out of Washington. That's my personal experience. Don't believe the bullshit that you hear online from some reporters. Oh, crime's down in D.C. Well, my infant nearly died.
Okay, look, obviously, I'm a dad. I don't wish that on anybody. I'm obviously sorry that happened, but your personal experience does not dictate reality for broad swaths of people. In fact, once again, there's a very woke formulation, right? Because I personally was victimized. That means everyone has to rearrange everything according to my sense of victimhood, right? This is what, I mean, you talk about what this is a point that conservatives have been making for years about liberals, is that their sob stories become the world's problem, right? And again, show me one of these mayors saying, no, crime is no problem. They're not. But the statistics clearly show that they have turned a corner to the point where you could say, hey, how about partnership and collaboration with these communities? How about doing things constructive within the community? Like, for example, just to pull an example out of the hat, the African People's Socialist Party, who we're going to be documenting in a couple of weeks. What did they do? They're building bakeries. They built a basketball court so that kids have something to do with their time, right? That is productive and healthy and social, right? You could do those things. No, he says, let's bulldoze the neighborhoods. let's just tear the community down.
In a drug fire, after mass shootings. So no, DC is not safe. And I can tell you this as a matter of fact, it is one of the worst, most racist narco states and welfare states imaginable. In that neighborhood that I would walk every single day, racial epithets were screamed at us. Rocks were thrown at us because we were white people. This city is a sunken place. It is an unsafe place. I mean, if that's what happens to me, imagine what happens to somebody who's like visiting here from a foreign country. Right? It's totally and wholly unsafe and a scar on the face of our country.
So let's tear it all down. So these are responses to Max's tweet. Atrocities committed abroad will eventually be committed at home. Yes. What do they call that? The Imperial Boomerang, right? Yep. Paulina Plaza said Palantir's Project Lavender was their tryout in Gaza. Face recognition AI is already being used by the State Department. Take a wild guess as to who they are targeting with the pro-Palestine protesters. Their sun cut flat. I've been saying we're all Palestinians now to the American globalist Zionist ruling class. I wasn't thinking, it was going to become so obvious so soon. And yes, so here's a write-up from Amnesty International. This is back from 2016 by Edith Garwood. With whom are many U.S. police departments training? With a chronic human rights violator, Israel. When the U.S. Department of Justice published a report August 10th, 2016, that documented widespread constitutional violations, discriminatory enforcement, and culture of retaliation within the Baltimore Police Department, there was rightly a general reaction of outrage. But what hasn't received as much attention is where Baltimore police received training on crowd control, use of force, and surveillance. Israel's national police, military, and intelligence services. Baltimore law enforcement officials, along with hundreds of others from Florida, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, California, Arizona, Connecticut, New York, Massachusetts, North Carolina, Georgia, Washington State, as well as the D.C. Capitol Police, have all traveled to Israel for training. Wow, that's a lot. That's a lot. Just a few municipalities here and there. Thousands of others have received training from Israeli officials here in the United States. Many of these trips are taxpayer funded, while others are privately funded. Since 2002, the Anti-Defamation League, the American Jewish Committee's Project Interchange, and the Jewish Institute for National Security Affairs have paid for police chiefs, assistant chiefs, and captains to train in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories. So that's one angle of this. The other angle of this is something I want to touch upon because this really affected my hometown of Newburgh, New York. What Benny Johnson's talking about is really nothing new. This is essentially urban renewal, That is essentially what this is. That's what he's talking about. He's talking about destroying large swaths of a city in order to essentially resegregate the area. So let's take a look at this.
And in the dust and toss the gauntlet before the feet of tyranny, and I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever.
It was that belief that guided politicians in the 1960s into making many of the urban planning decisions that became a reality in the U.S. At the expense of their cities, planners segregated neighborhoods. Many developers created a plan that would create a lasting solution that can still be seen today.
So redlining was a policy enacted in the 1930s during the Great Depression. And one of the first steps of this process was the government created this agency called the Homeowners Loan Corporation, the HOLC. And the HOLC went city by city, every single city in the United States, and graded each neighborhood for investment worthiness based on race, based primarily on race. A being best, D being worst. And basically in those D zones, the government would invest less in public services, things like sewer maintenance, firefighting. And in addition, banks were directed not to loan to people in those areas that received the lowest grades, and they specifically deprioritized neighborhoods that did not have white, or neighborhoods that were non-white.
Over time, the neighborhoods that local governments had chosen to divest in had lower property values and were able to be bought up by local governments to supposedly clean up the areas, often with little to no input from the people that still lived there.
The highways have the added benefit of being able to physically make that connection to the suburbs better. It's prioritizing that long distance suburban transit from the suburbs to the CBD over the local access.
So you can see there, as these highways go through, buildings are raised, people are displaced. This happened in New York City as well with the construction of the BQE. A lot of people were forced to leave their homes, and that led to the deindustrialization of a lot of the outer boroughs of New York City. And in a town like Newburgh, my hometown, this happened from 1962 to 1974. You had, I believe it was 1,100 buildings torn down. So here was the riverfront city district. The Hudson River there is at the top of those images. And see, look at all those buildings. Had a very thriving, diverse middle class in Newburgh because it was an industrial river city. So there were a lot of jobs, a lot of blacks living there, a lot of whites living there, low crime, fairly prosperous. And then urban renewal happened. They drew up the plans to tear all those buildings down. So everything in yellow got torn down. And there they are once more. That's the before picture. And then the after photo is that. They didn't build any of those streets back up. They just cleared that out. They just displaced the people there. That is what they did. That is Newburgh nowadays. And then they created some nice restaurants on the river with some yacht clubs and things like that for the wealthier people from the suburbs to come in and enjoy. And then you have this big buffer between that and the rest of the city, which remains fairly poor. So what did they do? They segregated the city through an urban renewal process. Between 1962 and 1974, 120 acres of waterfront land were cleared for redevelopment, causing the displacement of 15,000 residents and the demolition of over 1,100 buildings, including significant African-American homes, churches, businesses, and cultural centers. This considerably impacted the fabric of Newburgh. Oh, yes, it did. The effects of that: immiseration, poverty, and yes, crime. Newburgh now has a high poverty rate compared to both the surrounding metro area and the state of New York, a 27% poverty rate, significantly higher than the 11.2% rate for the surrounding area and more than double the state average. And crime, look at that. One of the most violent cities, not just in New York State, but in America, is Newburgh, New York. That is the legacy of the kind of intervention that Benny Johnson is advocating in Washington, D.C. Of course, tearing neighborhoods down and kicking people out leads to economic immiseration and, yes, more crime, not less crime. So there are two angles from which to look at this. One is from, yes, the imperial boomerang angle, where you look at what they're doing to the Gaza Strip and saying, yeah, that's basically his answer for Washington, D.C. The second is this. It's completely counterproductive is an understatement. It is destructive. He's advocating for the destruction of the neighborhood. Why? Because he had a bad experience in a high crime area of Washington, D.C. And as someone who lived in Newburgh, I can tell you it's a very common for mostly, I will say, white people who live in these inner city areas to become very bitter about what they see around them and blame the racial outgroup. And they tend to adopt pretty reactionary politics and pretty reactionary attitudes. And I know in my hometown, there's kind of a misunderstanding that urban renewal destroyed the white areas so that black people could have public housing built for them, because there were a few public housing units built in that strip of blocks that was completely gutted. But the reality is not that. The reality is, at least my hometown was a very diverse city all along, and you had a thriving black middle class that was kicked out of Newburgh, and the economy was decimated. And so that's the kind of project he's advocating for. He's talking about destroying a neighborhood and creating a segregated city where you have wealthy areas, vast expanses of nothingness, basically, and then slums on the other side of it.
I have lived in Harlem for over 18 years without incident, without problems. So this is one thing that underlies a lot of these narratives. You know, they can't come out and say that, not these days, but it's right there in the subtext. Yeah, you know, those black neighborhoods. Yeah, you know,
Well, of course.
I mean,
yeah.
You know, I'm not, you know, some 6'6" guy,
right.
You know, with you know, nobody's gonna mess with. I've never had a problem here, man. I didn't just move in. I've been here almost 2 decades. I've never had a problem. So I'm not, and I'm not going to say, look, New York gets that reputation because it's a media center. So New York gets overcovered in the news. It's overrepresented in the news. One of the things that really blew my mind the first time I drove cross country was finding out how much more dangerous a lot of other places are.
Oh, yeah.
That's when New York was really considered dangerous. And I found out it was actually pretty mild compared to South Central Los Angeles, South Side of Chicago. Like, I had never seen places that were that crime ridden and that impoverished. I'd never seen it. But I watched the same TV everybody else did. I even though I'm from here, I figured, well, you know, New York must be the most dangerous. That's what the TV tells me. And then I saw, no, they just don't talk about East St. Louis. Nobody does a crime show set in East St. Louis, so nobody's aware of it. All that to say, I'm not going to say, well, because Harlem's not like that, there's no place that's like that. But you know what? If you travel around the country, it's not about race, obviously. It's about poverty, man. There are white trash areas that have very similar problems. These are problems of poverty. These are problems that come with poverty. If you're a fucking fascist and you need to sell people on your fascist project, you cannot get into those nuances. You cannot get into why things are like this, because what defines you as a fascist is that you speak about problems in the society entirely from a perspective of punishment and the use of force to address them, with absolutely no concept of solidarity, of reaching out to actually help people. It's all about these people are this way because they're this way. Because they're this way. We don't have to talk about it. We have to tear down these neighborhoods. We have to fix it. And all of that is to trap your mind so that you, without really thinking it through, poor and working class white person, are going to support the construction of this fascist regime that in the end doesn't actually care any more about you than it does about these people. And you'll find that out very quickly when all of these wonderful jobs don't materialize from these deportations and from these tariffs, and you start speaking out about it. And now They got the low-hanging fruit out of the way. They got the brown immigrants out of the way. Now they went after the homeless people to justify all these prisons that they built to lock up the immigrants. They're done with the immigrants. Now they lock up the homeless people. Who do you think they're going to turn to next? All the dissidents, all the political dissidents. And you might be one of them when you find out that these factories are going to be automated, even if they get built, even if they do build them. So what do you think they're going to do to you? You think they're spending billions of dollars building a national police force and expanding the carceral state to just let it all fall to the wayside when they get rid of the immigrants? Now it's the military industrial complex, right? Once they had established those industries, then they needed war. So we've been at war all the time. Once they build that police force, once you have people who are lining their pockets, whose incomes, whose livelihoods depend on this enormous national police force, they're not going to disband it. Now they got to find things for them to do. What they're going to do is send them after you.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And that is a lot of what this DC experiment is a test case for.
Right.
It's not a response to crime. The numbers are what they are. All right. We've shown them to you. This is what Max said. He put another tweet out because he tweeted that big AI video, the simulation of MAGA becoming disaffected and coming for the government. And he said, I predict that, Trump will try to incite some sort of, if not a full-on race war, he will appeal to racial paranoia in order to bring his base to heel, which is his only play. And it's their only play at this point. Crime and punishment is their only play. It's the only thing they have left. It's the only thing. And even that is undermined by their spiking of the Epstein case. But that's all they have.
Wait until these states like Mississippi and Arkansas and Alabama lose all their rural hospitals overnight.
Yep. You're already seeing a lot of that. You're already seeing town halls erupt about Medicaid cuts and all this stuff. Yeah, absolutely.
Please clap.